Welcome to Trauma Undone. I am your host, Natasha Phillips, and today we have with us such an incredible woman, a woman who has gone through so much, come out on the other side, succeeding in life, sharing her story and her journey, and using it to help the world and, just make this place a better place. And we're so happy to have you in the studio today, Silva. I'm so looking forward to this interview and just being able to share your experience and how you've healed with everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
So Silva, I want to just dive right into it and really start with how your story began. This is what we're here to, there's only a limited amount of time that we have together. And I want our viewers just to really see where you were and see you today. You're this magnificent being on this earth, and it's just so wonderful that you're here. You're telling the story. You've healed. You are, I would love to just dive right into it and get started.
Thank you. It's interesting the way you just did the introduction and you talk about coming out on the other side and being healed. And I think everyone who's ever experienced any kind of trauma would say that it's a work in progress. And, I don't particularly see myself as healed, although I'm going to say that I'm doing better today than I did yesterday and better yesterday than the day before. And it's just a progression of healing and learning and growing and expanding. And as you let life unfold, you discover parts of yourself that you didn't realize was either exposed to trauma, or that it was trauma, or that your responses were part of trauma. And, I think everybody would agree that it's a process, right? It's a growing, learning process. But one thing I will say is that it takes being ready and being willing to explore those parts of you in order for the healing to begin. And while I was aware, while I had a lot of knowledge around it, I had done a lot of reading around it, while I continued to absorb information, doing that and actually then doing the work are two different things. You can attest to that, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until perhaps even recently, as recent as 2016, that I began sort of the journey of not just learning and knowing, because I knew a lot, but to allow myself to unpack some of that stuff. And it began with therapy, and it began with talking to people. It began with my willingness to actually go into the places that are necessary to then, unfold and evolve and heal. And I always said, and a lot of people who perhaps have had a lot of trauma or know that they're experiencing some symptoms of trauma, will attest that for me, I said, that's a can of worms. If I open it, I don't know if I can put it back in, or I don't know if I can handle what comes out of it. And it's really hard, because I think back in the last 5 years of what I've dealt with, it takes a lot to go through this healing journey.
It does. It definitely does. And it's such a good point that you brought up, is that sometimes it is so scary to even start to delve into it, that people avoid it.
I avoided it my entire life.
So what was that final thing that actually was okay, let's get over the fear and try to get through to the other side? What was that?
I don't think it's a willingness. I don't think anyone says, I think I'm going to get over the fear and just go do this. I think you go kicking and screaming. you don't willingly start this journey. Something happens in life that sort of turns your life upside down, or you get pushed into a corner, or something traumatic, much more traumatic than all the past experiences, happens where you can't ignore or avoid having to face it or deal with it. I personally think something significant happens, and you realize that the only way to get past it or get through it is to address some of the things really that are happening at that moment. But in reality, once you start addressing those, then all of the other stuff sort of comes out.
It's true. So, I mean, you were exposed to trauma at a relatively young age, and you kind of, did you feel that you used that to have such a drive and purpose in your life? Because you said that you only dealt with it later. So was the suppression of those feelings what drove you to be so successful?
Yes. And, when we talk about suppressing our feelings in order to sort of have a drive and move forward, there's a misconception that if you're suppressing your feelings, so you must have just kind of been going through life numb or not feeling anything. In reality, I have a hard shell on the outside, but I'm an incredibly sensitive person. I spent 25 years in journalism, and I told all sorts of stories. And there were days where I would interview victims of crimes or victims who've lost things significant in their lives, and I would cry with them, right? And I knew that I needed to continue to be sensitive, and I needed to hold on to my humanity in order for me to be able to tell these significant stories, in order for me to be able to tell a story that someone who's sitting at home on the couch could also feel. So it's not like I was numb. I was feeling things, and I was going through life doing the things ordinary people do in their lives. But I think what happens is that there's the part of you that is shut down is the part that cares for you. So, you care for everyone else. You care about the world. In fact, you over care about the world. You over care about everyone else. But you don't necessarily pay attention to yourself and to your own feelings and to your own needs and to your own, what you need to be okay. And that is the part of you that's shut down. And I wish someone had been able to actually explain the difference to me, because for the longest time, when I realized that was a symptom, and I was like, oh, well, then, I'm over my trauma because I feel things. But in reality, yes, but I also didn't feel for myself. I allowed other people to be abusive, to be harmful, to, treat me in ways that were what I called, it just rolls off my back. Because somehow the trauma has made you so hard about yourself, because you're constantly just in the state of tightness. It's the only way you know how to be in order to move forward, in order for you to operate at that speed, at that pace, at that intensity. At least for me, you talked about my childhood, so I'll tell you a little bit about that.
I would love for you to share that. Yeah.
Just like so many people in Los Angeles who are immigrants, I have a very similar story. I was born in Iran. I was raised in Iran. I was born just a few years before the Iranian Revolution. So as like a 3-4-year-old, I remember the Iranian Revolution, and people are like, well, how could you remember? You were only 3. And this is, I think, where trauma starts to set in, where I have moments and visions, and it's almost like video clips that are seared in my memory of what things look like, what things felt like, what things smelled like, right? As a child, it was such an intense experience that it made such an impression on me that I remember as an adult what that was like. So I lived through the Iranian Revolution. And if anyone knows any history following the Iranian Revolution and the intensity of what happened to the country, then it led to the Iran-Iraq War, which then, lasted for 10 years. I lived in Iran and grew up in Iran for most of that time. And my daily life was getting up in the middle of the night, because we would sleep in the middle of the living room with my parents and my sister on the carpet on the floor with the radio on, listening for sirens. And the moment the sirens come, it doesn't matter how deep your sleep, your brain is programmed. The moment you listen to the sirens, you are up and awake and fully awake, like you've been operating like during the day, in the middle of the night. And we would escape to the basement and stand underneath the staircase and wait until the sirens would stop. And essentially the sirens would say that there's enemy planes that have crossed the border and there might be a missile or a bomb landing somewhere in the country. Who knows where? Towards, 2-3 years into the war, it was no longer government buildings and military outlets, and it was more about civilians and marketplaces. And so you never really knew where it would go. So living in that kind of intensity and also in the unknown of, am I next? As a child, at that moment, you don't know any different and you don't know any better. You're just going through life. And I remember it wasn't until much, much later as an adult when I think back at it and I'm like, how did we function? Because in the middle of the night, over and over and over and over again, every single night, you're getting woken up from deep sleep to have to experience a traumatic event of not knowing whether this is your last day on earth. And then going back upstairs, going back to sleep like nothing ever happened, waking up at 7 a.m. and going to school as if life is normal. And doing that for, 6-8 years.
That's so intense. And that, it so often happens with prolonged trauma, is that these things become normal.
Yeah.
It just becomes normalized. And so moving from that experience and thinking that that's normal and then moving to the US, how was that transition for you?
Also traumatic because you go from that is normal because you don't know any different. Also remember, in Iran, there's censorship, there's no TV, you don't know what life is like outside of Iran. And this is kind of relevant now because of what's happening in Iran.
That was another question that I have for you. I wanted to know, I have another question for you related to that, because I wanted to know, because that also often happens with a lot of trauma, is that you have something that happens to you. And then later in life, or a few years past that experience, you have something that similar, or someone goes through something similar, and then it kind of brings up all those emotions. So I wanted to also know how that you feel about that. But let's go back to you moving to the US.
We'll circle back to that one. So, I didn't know what I didn't know as a child. I just knew that was life, right? That was the circumstances we were living in. And when you don't know any different, you go about your day. And leaving the country was pretty traumatic. We escaped, and we were in Germany for 2 years in limbo as we were waiting for our papers. And that was a whole other experience. I'd never experienced the West before. I never experienced the culture or the way of thinking, and the mindset. So for me to go from being an Armenian, Christian, Iranian girl, right in my teens, like I was like 12 years old, to all of a sudden to the Western world of how they operate. It was night and day, and that took incredible adjustment.
And I just want to also clarify, you didn't speak any other language at this point?
No. So I spoke Armenian because we speak Armenian at home. And then I spoke Farsi because that's what you learn in school and you need it to live in the country, obviously. I had taken some English lessons. My dad had hired a tutor who was essentially teaching me words. So I had this little workbook, and I still have it, believe it or not. I think I'm going to frame it. And just simple words like understand, teach, bread. And so I had learned basic.
Did your dad get that tutor because he was planning for your exit, or was that not?
No, it was, also I went to a Armenian private French school run by nuns in Iran. And I could either take French or English, and I decided to take English. But it was, it was my first year in school taking it. So I knew some words, but I didn't know much English at all, actually. So when I got to Germany, now I'm in Germany and I have to communicate. I know very basic words in English, and that's it. So essentially, I learned both German and some English at the same time, because German was necessary to go to school, but also they had English classes. So then I sat in English classes. And then from there, I was there for 2 years, and then we came to the United States, immigrated to Los Angeles because that's where family was. And I started school at 10th grade.
Wow.
So as a sophomore, I went to school and I was like, okay, I'm going to have to take classes. Needless to say, I did really well in classes that didn't require English as much. But when you think about that, and when I say trauma comes as a process, and the unfolding of this experience is a process, is at the time, in the middle of it, you just do it. You do what you have to do, and you just put one foot in front of the other and you figure it out. It wasn't until much, 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 much later, even more recently, when I look back even at my experience in the United States, and I think, where in the world did you get the strength? Or where in the world how did you find the courage to do that? What made you think that that was possible, right? So I went from not speaking a word of English in 10th grade to then graduating as a senior with, honors and accolades, and then
being a journalist,
and then
all about English.
Right. Applied to USC. I only applied to one university. Hello, like the audacity, right? And I didn't apply to I applied to USC, and USC looked at my test scores and was like, yeah, no, you're not getting in. Even though I'd built this incredible resume to offset my, but then I, did what most people do. I took a job right out of high school, and I went to community college at night. And then after 2 years at community college, I reapplied to USC and got in. And I literally went through school with dictionaries and tutors and help writing papers. And, I had to get a lot of support to do that. And then in my last year at USC, I was like, I think I'm going to be a journalist. And people literally laughed at me. They would look at me and they'd be like, I'm sorry, come again? You're going to do what? Because at the time, I had a very heavy Armenian, Iranian, German accent. And they were like, oh, you're going to write for the newspaper? I was like, no, I'm going to be a television journalist. It was more like, no, I'm going to be a television journalist. A very heavy accent of just not even, there was words I couldn't even pronounce properly. And I went for it. I was like, I'm going to figure it out, because you cannot outwork me. And this is part of the trauma. You literally work yourself to the bone because you don't have the ability to care for yourself. And working and staying busy and productive is how you define your worth.
Yeah.
And when I think about it, it was probably a coping mechanism, which, the silver lining in that is that it helped. I don't ever need motivation. I don't ever need inspiration. It's just there, but it's there from that place. It's an unhealthy place if I don't keep it in check. But at the time, I didn't even know that it needed to be kept in check. But that, to answer your earlier question, it absolutely drove me to, and also it keeps you laser focused, right? I was very focused. I had a plan. I had a method of doing it, and I was going to figure it out because it was part of my survival. And also there was a lot of self-talk. If I survived the war, this is icing on the cake. If I survived leaving the country and dealing with, I can handle this. So it's this always this comparison of, this is not worse than what I've already experienced. So therefore this should be a piece of cake, even though it's really hard, and these are the things that, in hindsight, I look at and I'm certain that I identified along the way, but the conversation I had with myself was, I have to make the sacrifice worth it. I had to make the sacrifice that my parents made worth it. And also I have to make myself worthy. And the way I defined myself being worthy was to do this audacious thing that was impossible. It took me 20 some odd years to do it, but I did it.
You did it.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. So I want to circle back to that question about what is happening now and how you're feeling about it and the type of emotions that are coming up for you.
What is happening now
in
Iran? So, you are reliving it, right? It's bringing up things that I didn't even realize it's bringing up, and I'm much better today than I used to be when I wasn't dealing with my trauma. But it's intense because for many years I was the only voice and I was the only representative in many rooms, on many tables, in many circumstances, where I would try to explain what the experience was like. And a lot of people just kind of give you this blank stare and also don't acknowledge the experience. And when that happens over and over again, you start questioning your own narrative. And you start questioning whether the experience you had was really that intense. Could I have been a child? Am I making a big deal about it? Was it really that intense? Was it really that bad was I really that scared at the time? And what this revolution has done is it has solidified all of the experiences I had. And it has solidified all of the stories that I told in all of these different rooms to people that didn't even know where Iran is on the map. And the significance of that experience and the result of it and the consequences of it. Simple things like having to walk down the street and be fearful of your life because you're not covered, or you are covered, but it just so happens that someone woke up on the wrong side of bed on that particular day and decides that they want to, give you a hard time. Growing up, for me, it brought up stories I remember hearing as a child, but sort of forgot about, right? Growing up, remembering stories of women who had acid thrown on their faces and their bodies because they weren't covered up, not necessarily according to the law, but because someone who represented themselves as part of the government decided that particular look wasn't acceptable. Just thinking about living in those conditions and listening to those stories. And it really, for me, gave validation to my own trauma and made me stop and do a bit more self-care and show more compassion for myself and for the experience. And the conversation with myself has been very different. That, yes, that was traumatic. Yes, you did go through something that was horrific. And it has its rightful place in your psyche and in your physiology. And I think the worst thing we can do is ignore the trauma that we experience, and not just the trauma, but the consequences and the results, right? Because it shows up differently. You know, it shows up with me not being irritable, or with me just not being able to get out of bed, or and it's not just me, but for people, right? And you don't understand why that's happening. It's not until you acknowledge the experience that then you are able to identify what the symptoms are, which is then you're able to take care of it, and you take care of yourself and take care of the trauma that is impacting you. So, you know, I've had to limit my exposure to the information on some level, even though I'm a journalist. I've been very active, and I've been using my voice to educate. I've been doing stories consistently, and I still have to be mindful of how it's impacting my capacity and my ability to be present. So it has brought up a lot up from the past. It has made me realize a lot about myself. It has also made me more of who I am, because now the world sees what I've been saying for 25 years, where everyone else has discounted it and didn't think it was that significant and important. You know, it's like, it feels like, you know, when someone gaslights you, and the impact of that.
Yeah.
That's really what I've been coping with that. Because I'm like, yeah, you are gaslighting me. I stand firm in my experience. You know, so it's been tough. It's been really, really hard. I mean, everyone who's Iranian, who's got relatives or has any kind of connection or history, it is extremely difficult, because it's not just about the revolution and the regime. It's also about grief. It's all about the lives that are there, the lives that were changed, the lives that were lost, the impact of what could have been had things not gone the way it did. You know what I mean? There's so much loss and pain associated with that, you know, that it's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, also, like, your lives were changed because of it, because you would have stayed in Iran if it wasn't for the revolution and then the war, and you would have just stayed there.
Hundreds of thousands of people we're not talking about a little bit change, but there's, you know, my own family. My father worked his whole life to build a life there. In his 30s, he was retired. He had to leave everything behind to escape the country and start all over again. When you talk about the impact of that on him, the impact of that on us, the impact of that on our children, I mean, and that's just one story. There's hundreds of stories, not to mention people who ended up in prison, not to mention people who ended up losing people in the war, people that ended up being tortured. I mean, the trickle-down effect of this experience is immense and immeasurable. It really is.
Yeah, it's all. I feel that all trauma, like whenever a person experiences trauma, it affects so many generations thereafter. I mean, and this is a whole country and a community, and it has such lasting effects.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've been talking about the negative aspect of the experience, but it's also had an incredible, I want to make sure that I mentioned a positive aspect of it, because it has united us and it has collectively given us a voice in the recognition of what's happening and the experiences that people have had and the lives that they have lived for 43 years, and I lived some of it. Having that acknowledged, recognized, understood, and collectively coming together to sort of have a voice around that, and to stand firm and say it's enough. This is not humane. It's a human rights violation. When you're able to actually recognize it and say it and do it collectively, there is healing around that too. You feel understood, you feel validated, you feel acknowledged, and that is part of the healing process. You can't go back and change the past. You can't undo your trauma, but you can take it as a opportunity to sort of grow from it, acknowledge it, and figure out how to put the pieces together and what it is you can do to also move forward in that space.
And do you feel that what's happening now has deepened your healing?
Yes, and ironically, this is the second wave. The first wave was the Armenian War. I don't know if you are aware of it. That happened in September of 2020. There was an intense attack on people who were targets. It's a complicated political land issue, but it's towards the indigenous Armenians in Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Artsakh. And they were shelled, and there was, phosphorus gas used. It was pretty intense, and that was painful to watch. And seeing your people attacked, even though the attack is not on you, we know the connection of generational trauma and how all of that pain lives within us, right? And living through that was also the first wave of, generational trauma being, ignored, being victims of genocide in the past, and then having it reoccur in front of our eyes in our lifetime. And dealing with that was also just as intense, but also an opportunity to use my voice, an opportunity to educate, an opportunity to bring the suffering of people to the foreground. And for me, that has been the healing process, right? The healing process. I think I was doing this as a journalist, telling other people's stories, and I felt like that was healing on some level for a lot of people. And this time, in this period of my life, I've been telling a lot of stories that flow through me because of who I am, and I've spent a lot of time telling those stories and educating. And this is the second wave in Iran. So there's been a lot of, this is what I meant when I say opening up a can of worms. Because there's just so much, and some of it is yours, and some of it is, from the past, and, from generations ago. But you have no idea why you feel like you are feeling what you're feeling in that moment in time when something is happening, and you have to really sit back and observe and pay attention to your own physiology and your own mindset, to understand that perhaps this is something that's been passed down to you through your DNA that you don't even have an understanding of. And, seek help. Talking to people is extremely important. I think there's not enough, even though mental health is such a big deal now and people talk about it, it's still within my own community, both the Iranian community and the Armenian community, it's still somewhat taboo when you talk about mental health, when you talk about therapy. It's absolutely necessary.
I completely agree. I've said it all my life, everyone needs a therapist. Like, that should be like, you're born and here's your therapist.
Perhaps two, depending on the strength of the therapist.
But I want to actually shift gears a little bit and talk about your journey. What was what were some of the things that you did in the beginning to really start getting into this and start to unpack your trauma and to be able to cope with it, look at it, deal with it?
I think the first thing I did was make a decision. And the decision wasn't, I'm going to heal from this trauma, because that's not the decision. The decision is, I'm going to figure this out. I don't know what I'm figuring out. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to figure, the decision is, I'm going to do whatever's necessary to figure this out, because I want to be better and I want to be more of myself, and I'm not feeling myself, right? So when I said something traumatic happens, it normally, shifts your access, right? And your equilibrium, and you don't feel like yourself. And in that space of something happened to me, and it had to do with my career and work, and I did not feel like myself anymore. And that was really heartbreaking for me, because while parts of myself were suppressed because of trauma, the parts of myself that were alive, I really liked. And I did not know how to go back to that. Newsflash, you never go back. That's the hardest and most painful thing to admit, and realize and cope with. But you do figure out how to put the pieces together in a new way. And wow. I didn't think that I would be sitting here talking about this even as early as maybe 2 years ago. I was literally sleeping in my old bedroom at my parents' house and just sleeping the day away, because I was mourning the person I used to be. And I remember reading and hearing people say, you never go back to that person. And that was so heartbreaking and sad for me, because I really liked that person. So that's the second decision I had to make, is it was in my power. It is in my power. I may not be able to go back to who I was, but I can't put a new person together using the pieces that I did like. I do have that power. And that is also a journey and a process. I'm going to go back a little further. And you said, what did you do? I made a decision. And then I made a decision to only listen to my voice, to my inner voice, which also meant that I needed to spend a lot of time alone, which is counterintuitive, because if you've had intense trauma, sometimes being alone isn't the best thing in the world, because they talk about having a support system around you. But in my case, I really needed to be able to listen to myself again and hear my voice.
So can I ask you, because so often when you've had trauma, you don't trust your voice.
Yes.
So how did you build that trust?
I just trusted it. Because what I realized, and this is something that you really do step out on faith, and you have to trust that there is an innate physical and spiritual being that keeps you alive. You know what I mean? Like the instinct, the human instinct, right? Like if I'm walking down a path, and if I come at the edge of a ledge of a, big fall, the internal instinct isn't to take another step, right? The internal instinct is to stop and sit down or back up. So I had to go back and trust in that internal, intrinsic, very basic instinct, that my instincts aren't going to let me die, right? That was the starting point. And slowly listening to that voice. And I have to tell you, it was really hard, because instinctively, when you start listening to your voice, it makes no sense. And it does not go with your logic. It doesn't go with planning. It doesn't go with anything that we have been told in the outside world to follow, right? For me, all of a sudden, my instinct was, I need to leave. And I had to sit with that because I was like, am I trying to escape this? Is that why my instinct is telling me to leave? But instinctively, I was like, no, I'm being told I need to leave, or I'm feeling like I need to leave. And however it is you define listening to yourself. And at that moment in time, it was like, okay, I need to leave. But I at the time I was living in Miami. And it wasn't, I need to leave to go to LA because my parents live here. It was more like, I need to go on a one-way ticket somewhere. And I think if you listen to your instinct and you step out on faith, everything that is meant to be sort of aligns itself. And the hardest part is to do that first part, and everything else falls into place. So if you just focus on listening to your voice and then following through with that voice, it's amazing what happens. And for me, what ended up happening is I literally packed my house in 48 hours. I had bought a one-way ticket to Europe, and I traveled across Europe for 6 weeks. And it was exactly what I needed, and it was absolutely necessary because it took me out of my environment that had me feeling stuck. It also forced me to use parts of my brain that made me feel alive. It also activated different parts of myself because I was in another country and another language, and I kept getting lost and it created a momentum and movement in my life and my spirit and my in my mind that allowed me to create momentum to move forward. From that point, every decision I've made has been instinctive. 90% of it makes no sense. It's not logical. I'm like, I can't afford this. This doesn't make any sense. I ended up, had a great life in Miami. Instinctively, I was like, I need to go back to LA. I was like, but I love my life in Miami. No, I need to go back to LA. You listen to your instinct. And I'm glad I did, because I ended up here. And within a few months, we had the shutdown and lockdown during COVID. And I was here with my family. I was here with my parents. I was here with my sister and her kids, and allowed me to spend incredible amount of time with them and help take care of them, which I would have never done. I mean, when I look back, that is the turning point, is being able to allow yourself to be guided by your inner voice and stepping out on faith.
That is so beautiful. And I'm just thinking about it and thinking about people who have been, through trauma. Mm-hmm. Those are two things that I think, having spoken to a few people, is that those are two things that they really are challenged with. Mm-hmm. They're challenged in trusting themselves because they feel like they've lost that trust with themselves, and they don't feel like they have that faith because they feel like they've been let down.
All of those things are true. Absolutely true.
So I find it so incredible that you did that, and you were so fearless in doing that, and just you made the decision, and that was it. It was like, I'm listening to myself.
All of those things are true, and I don't want to discount how hard it is. I'm not going to lie, I did have a great support system. I had a great therapist for a while. I have some amazing friends around me who have really helped me stay in really true stand in faith, which becomes challenging. And I told somebody the other day that I realized through this process, I've been mad at God, because my entire life and my entire career, it was all faith. I didn't see progress. I didn't see opportunity. Every door shut in front of me. There were no windows open. And the reason I made it through my career is simply on faith, believing that it was possible, that if I worked hard enough and long enough, that it would happen. It was all on faith. And every decision I've made has been based on that. So when you end up in a situation where you feel like you've been through all of this trauma to get here, and even though this is what you've experienced, you still are a good human being. You've achieved, you've accomplished, you've done all the right things, but then you're let down. So how could you go back and have faith again? So I totally understand that. But the reality of the matter is, faith is about also trusting that there's a reason why this is happening. It's also believing that, perhaps the experience we're having is because we've outgrown who we are, and we need to be in a different place, in a different environment, as a different person. And the only way that can happen is if we are so uncomfortable that we make the choice to go through that experience. And I know I'm repeating a lot of the things that I've heard other people say, and it seems so simple, and sounds so eloquent, and it sounds so easy to do, but it's significantly hard. And I always think about, how would I describe this if I had to break it down into steps, right? How would I give someone an instruction if I needed to? And there isn't one. It's messy, it's ugly, and when you're in it, you can't understand it and accept it. You just do your best to recognize those signs and do the best you can in that moment.
That's amazing advice, and I hope that everyone hears it.
Advice: be compassionate for yourself. I mean, have compassion. That's been my biggest and most difficult thing to do. If having compassion for myself and understanding that I have a capacity, and honoring that capacity, and allowing myself to, this is the part where allowing myself to feel myself and also honor what I'm feeling is eventually, when you go through the steps, you get to that. And that is a daily practice.
So yeah, compassion is also a big thing for me. I'm still learning it every day.
How are you compassionate to yourself?
For me, the way I can deal with my compassion is that I remind myself of where I was and where I am today. And it's been a journey, and it's still a journey, and there's still long way to go. But that gives me compassion, because I'm like, you know what, I have come a long way. And if I can wake up and show up well, that's good enough.
Yeah. Just a day by day.
Yeah.
A day by day, and one day at a time. And my motto used to be a little bit better today than you were yesterday. But I don't know if that was the doer in me. That was the one who wanted to accomplish all the time. And I still do. That never goes away. But I also add to be more of yourself today than you were yesterday. And that sometimes means, guess what? I stay in bed all day because I want to rest.
Yeah.
Or I allow myself to do something creative that day. That doesn't be better, be more of yourself is very different than
do more
better. You know what I mean? Doing, or it's two different things.
We're human beings, not human doings.
Human doings, exactly. And when I used to say that, it was all about add a skill to your life, or push yourself a little further to be better at what you do, or whatever it might be. It was a very different type of be a better you today than yesterday. But now it's about being more of me and just being, and whatever that looks like. And if it means I sleep today because it will give me the capacity to do a better job at what it is that I want to do the next day, then so be it. And that's, I think, where compassion comes in. And, feeling yourself comes in, and being informed about your own trauma and what your needs are.
So Silva, we are at the end of our time.
Oh my gosh, have we been talking for that long?
It flew by. I wish we had the rest of the afternoon to sit here and chat. But is there anything that you want to share that we haven't touched on?
Yes. There's always hope. and there's always support. And if all else fails, listen to your own voice. Listen, and if you can't hear your voice, listen to it physically. Listen to your physiology. Listen to your body. Sometimes we can't hear that voice in our ears or in our mind or in our heart, but we can sense it and feel it physically. So do whatever you need to do to create an environment for yourself to be able to feel what's happening, and so that you can eventually, the feeling of the physiology will then help you listen to yourself. And, you know, one step at a time, one day at a time. And yeah, I mean, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So,
well, it's been such an honor
Thank
to
you.
speak with you today and for you to share your story. I feel so privileged. Just if people want to get in touch with you or follow the work that you're doing, where can people find you?
Yes, it's everything is under my first and last name, Silva Harapetian. So I have an Instagram account, Silva Harapetian. I have a YouTube page with lots of great interviews just like this with a lot of people who have some really interesting, much more deeper, educated things to say about trauma and growth and you know, self-development. And it's under Silva Harapetian. So find me on any of the social networks. Or
I'll put all the links in the
yes,
show notes as well.
and my email address is also on my social networks. So yeah, come say hi.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for watching Trauma Undone, and let your healing begin.